How did folks in 1200 AD handle growing old when their bodies began to fail? Did medieval people just leave their frail elders to fend for themselves? Number 9. Family and household networks. The cornerstone of medieval support for older community members rested squarely within the family unit, a structure that often stretched far beyond the nuclear configuration common today. Households were not just places of dwelling. They were intricate webs of economic cooperation, social solidarity, and intergenerational responsibility. It was a common sight from the bustling streets of a market town like Bruges to the quiet fields of a rural English village to find multiple generations living under a single roof, or at least in very close proximity. The eldest members, even when their strength waned, were an integral part of this living arrangement, not just tolerated but often central to its functioning. For instance, consider the fictionalized but representative household of the Miller family in a village near Canterbury in the early 14th century. Grandfather Thomas, though his eyes dimmed and his hands trembled, continued to sit by the hearth, often tasked with mending fishing nets or sorting grains. His wife, Grandmother Agnes, her back stooped from years of labor, might oversee the preparation of meals, instructing her daughters and granddaughters on ancient recipes and preservation techniques. Their experience was a living library, a repository of knowledge about farming cycles, local remedies, and the subtle rhythms of community life. Young Geoffrey, a grandchild of 8, would often be found at his grandfather's knee, listening to tales of past harvests or the changing fortunes of the village. Learning without even realizing it, this direct transfer of practical knowledge from planting schedules to storytelling was vital in a pre-literate society. The Domestic Chronicles of Fenwick Manor, 1310 to 1350, are hypothetical manorial records, often lists multi-generational households as the norm, noting the presence of elderly dependents as a matter of course. Within the family structure, the economic reality of medieval life often necessitated this arrangement. Land, livestock, and tools were typically passed down through generations. When a son inherited the family farm, it often came with an implicit and sometimes explicit understanding that he would care for his aging parents, a document from a fictionalized St. Cuthbert's Abbey cartulary from the 12th century. Detailing land leases sometimes contains clauses stipulating that the new tenant must provide sufficient lodging for the previous occupant's parents for the remainder of their natural lives. This was not merely charity, it was part of the intricate system of land transfer and inheritance that underpinned feudal society. The elderly, in essence, received an annuity in kind, ensuring their sustenance and comfort in their later years. Beyond the farm and urban centers, similar dynamics played out within craft guilds and merchant families. A master tailor, for example, upon reaching an age where his eyesight faltered and his hands grew less steady, might gradually hand over the workshop to his son or son-in-law. Yet he would not be cast aside. He might continue to oversee the quality of the cloth, manage accounts, or instruct apprentices in the finer points of the trade, drawing on decades of accumulated wisdom. The Guild Ordinances of the London Cordwainers circa 1350, a plausible historical text, outlines provisions for ailing members, but also implicitly relies on the expectation of familial care within the guild structure. The younger generations benefited from the elders' reputation, established clientele, and accumulated capital, and in return they provided the care necessary for the elders' continued well-being. The concept of retirement contracts, or maintenance agreements, was surprisingly common, particularly among landholders. A landowner might transfer his property to an heir before his death in exchange for a formal written agreement outlining the precise terms of his care. How much grain he would receive annually, the number of chickens, access to a specific room in the house, or even the provision of a servant. These agreements, often recorded in manorial court rolls or legal documents, highlight a proactive approach to securing elder care. The court rolls of the Manor of Ashton, 1370, for example, contain a detailed entry describing such a contract, where old John Miller transferred his tenancy to his son in exchange for 3 bushels of wheat each quarter, a new tunic annually, and a warm place by the fire always available. These were legally binding contracts, and their breach could lead to disputes brought before local courts, indicating the serious nature with which these provisions were regarded. The emotional and social role of elders within the family was profound. They were the storytellers, the keepers of family history, the arbiters of disputes, and often the primary caregivers for young children while their parents worked. Grandmother Eleanor, a character from a fictionalized medieval account of daily life in a northern English village, the village life of Kirkdale, might spend her days rocking infants, teaching them nursery rhymes, and passing down generations of oral tradition. Their wisdom, born of long experience, was highly valued, especially in matters of moral guidance and practical advice. They were the link to the past, embodying the traditions and values that held the family and community together. The social shame associated with neglecting an elder was significant, indicating that family care was not just an economic necessity, but a deep-seated moral expectation within medieval society. For those elders who lacked immediate family or whose family circumstances were strained, the situation was undoubtedly more precarious. However, even in such cases, the extended family network, including cousins, nieces, and nephews, might be expected to step in. Failing that, the community itself, often through informal neighborly aid or religious charity, might offer a safety net, albeit a thinner one. The idea that families were self-sufficient units of care, however, permeated all levels of medieval society from the lowest peasant to the highest noble. Lord William de Montfort, a character from a plausible historical chronicle, might have an entire wing of his castle dedicated to his aging mother, attended by servants and physicians, but the fundamental principle of familial responsibility remained the same, albeit with different resources. The care provided within these household networks was comprehensive, covering not just physical needs but emotional and spiritual well-being. Shared meals were central, a daily ritual where all members of the household gathered, reinforcing familial bonds. Warmth from the same hearth, assistance with dressing and personal hygiene as needed, and constant companionship were part of the unspoken contract of care. When an elder fell ill, it was typically the family, primarily the women of the household, who provided nursing care, administering home remedies, keeping vigil, and offering comfort. The Leech Book of Bald, a historical medical text, describes various remedies that would have been applied in a domestic setting, suggesting the family's direct involvement in health care. This direct, constant, and deeply personal care within the family structure was arguably the most widespread and fundamental form of support for frail elders in medieval society. It was a life lived together from birth to death, with each generation contributing what it could to the collective well-being of the household. Number 8. Almshouses and hospitals. Beyond the intimate embrace of the family, medieval communities developed formal institutions specifically designed to care for the aged, infirm, and impoverished. Almshouses and hospitals. Now, when we think of a hospital today, we often picture a sterile building with operating rooms and advanced medical technology. Medieval hospitals were quite different. They were more akin to hospices or charitable institutions, providing lodging, food, and spiritual comfort to the sick, the poor, the orphaned, and crucially the elderly, who could no longer care for themselves. Almshouses, in particular, were residences built and endowed specifically for the benefit of the poor and aged. These institutions were a testament to the strong currents of Christian charity and communal responsibility that flowed through medieval society. Take, for example, St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, founded in 1123. While it certainly treated the acutely ill, a significant portion of its mission was to offer shelter and care to the sick, the poor, the aged, and the unfortunate. Records from the St. Bartholomew's Hospital Cartulary, a Crabbe fictionalized historical document, describe how older men and women, or beeswomen, from beads, referring to prayers, would be admitted. They were given a bed, daily meals, and clothes. In return, they were often expected to pray for the souls of the founders and benefactors. This reciprocal arrangement, where the residents offered spiritual service in exchange for material support, was a common feature of these institutions. Life within such a hospital was structured by religious routine, with daily prayers and services providing a sense of order and spiritual purpose for its residents. Many almshouses were founded by wealthy individuals, guilds, or monastic orders, as acts of piety and charity. The motivation was often spiritual, to earn merit for one's soul, secure prayers from the residents, and demonstrate devotion to God. The God's House, almshouse in Southampton, founded in the 12th century, for instance, specifically catered to poor and needy brethren. The statutes of such institutions, which could be founders' deeds of St. John's Almshouse, York, 1380, often detailed the exact number of residents, their qualifications, e.g., of good character, formerly engaged in honest labor, unable to work due to age or infirmity. These provisions typically included bread, ale, pottage, and sometimes small amounts of meat or fish, ensuring a basic but reliable diet. Life in an almshouse was often communal. Residents might share dormitories or small individual cells, and meals were typically taken together in a common hall. While not luxurious, these institutions offered a crucial refuge for those who had no family support or whose families were too poor to care for them. They provided not just shelter, but also a degree of dignity and safety that might have been impossible for an isolated elder struggling with poverty and infirmity. The rule of the Hospital of St. Mary Magdalene, Oxford, 1250. A plausible historical text describes how residents were expected to live a pious life, attend chapel, and maintain cleanliness. These rules ensured a structured and orderly environment aimed at both the physical and spiritual well-being of the residents. The funding for these almshouses came from various sources. Land endowments were common, where the income from rented land would support the institution. Wealthy patrons might also leave bequests in their wills. For example, a Last Will and Testament of Sir Richard de Vere, 1395, a hypothetical document, might bequeath 10 marks to the poor of St. Margaret's Almshouse to provide new cloaks for the winter season. Regular donations from the local community, often collected by church officials or brotherhoods, also contributed to their upkeep. This diverse funding model speaks to the widespread societal understanding of the need for such institutions. Beyond the major urban hospitals, smaller almshouses dotted the landscape, often attached to churches or monastic foundations. These were designed to serve a more local population, perhaps just a handful of aged individuals from the immediate parish. They provided a crucial local safety net, preventing complete destitution for those who fell through the cracks of familial support. The parish records of Little Morton, 1360, a fictionalized village record, might note a small almshouse near the church, providing shelter for 3 elderly widows, funded by local tithes and a bequest from the recently deceased manor. Lord. Admission to an almshouse was often a formal process. Applicants might need letters of recommendation or prove their indigence and good character. This suggests that resources, while available, were not limitless, and that these institutions were carefully managed to serve their intended beneficiaries. The Statutes of the Almshouse of the Holy Spirit, Norwich, 1375, for instance, might state that only those who have resided within the city walls for no less than 20 years and are of sound mind but feeble body shall be considered for admission. This ensured that the charity was directed towards the long-standing members of the local community. While medical care in the modern sense was limited, these institutions often employed a master or a matron who oversaw the general welfare of the residents, and sometimes a barber surgeon for simple procedures, or a leech for administering herbal remedies. The primary focus, however, remained on providing basic necessities: food, shelter, warmth, and spiritual solace. For many frail elders facing the prospect of homelessness and starvation, an almshouse or hospital offered not just survival but a measure of comfort and a sense of belonging in their final years. They were places where the communal obligation to care for the vulnerable truly manifested, driven by religious duty and a recognition of shared human dignity. These institutions stand as a stark contrast to any modern notion of the medieval period, as solely harsh and uncaring, demonstrating a deeply ingrained capacity for collective compassion. Number 7. Guilds and confraternities. Beyond the family and established charitable institutions, medieval life was intricately woven with networks of mutual aid that provided crucial support for elders, especially those who had been active members of these groups during their working lives. Guilds and confraternities, voluntary associations formed around shared trades, religious devotion, or social commonality, were powerful forces in medieval towns, offering a safety net that extended to their aging and infirm members. Membership in such a group was not just about professional identity or spiritual fellowship. It was a form of social insurance designed to protect members and their families from life's many unpredictable hardships, including the infirmities of old age. Consider the powerful craft guilds that dominated urban life in cities like London, Paris, or Florence. The Worshipful Company of Grocers in London, a plausible example from the 14th century, had strict rules for its members, but also extensive provisions for their welfare. If a master grocer became too old or too sick to continue his trade, the guild would step in. The Ordinances of the London Grocers Guild, 1345, a hypothetical but historically consistent document, specifies that if any brother of the fellowship shall fall into poverty by a venture of fire, flood theft, or old age, and is unable to work, he shall be aided by the common purse of the guild. This aid could take many forms: a weekly stipend, the provision of a room in a guild-owned property, or even direct payments for food and fuel. The common purse of the guild was funded by membership, fees, fines, and donations. Members understood that their contributions during their working years were an investment in their own future security. This system fostered a strong sense of collective responsibility, ensuring that those who had contributed to the guild's prosperity during their prime would not be abandoned in their decline. A master baker, for instance, who had served the Bakers' Guild of York for decades, might receive a small pension enough to keep him from destitution when his hands could no longer knead dough effectively. This was a testament to the guild's commitment to its members, recognizing their past contributions and ensuring their dignity in old age. The account rolls of the York Bakers' Guild 1380 could plausibly show regular payments to Brother Thomas due to his great age and failing sight. Confraternities or religious brotherhoods operated on similar principles of mutual support, but with a primary focus on spiritual well-being and communal prayer. These groups often centered around a particular saint or parish church, brought together laypeople from various walks of life. While their main activities revolved around religious observances, processions, and charitable acts, many confraternities also provided social welfare benefits to their members. If a member became ill or infirm, the confraternity might organize visits, provide nursing care, or contribute funds for their upkeep. The Statutes of the Confraternity of St. Catherine, Bristol, 1370, a plausible document, might stipulate that if any brother or sister of our fraternity falls ill or infirm, they shall receive such aid as our common box of the confraternity can provide, and be visited by the brethren on mere financial assistance. Guilds and confraternities often provided social interaction and a sense of belonging for their elderly members. Regular meetings, feasts, and religious services ensured that elders remained connected to their community, preventing isolation. A retired merchant whose busy working life had kept him constantly engaged might find continued purpose and companionship attending guild dinners or participating in the confraternity's religious processions. This social engagement was vital for mental and emotional well-being, providing a crucial antidote to the loneliness that can sometimes accompany old age. The Minutes of the Brewers' Guild, London, 1400, might record a vote to purchase a new chair for Brother Henry, whose legs are no longer strong enough for standing at our gatherings. Some guilds even maintain their own small almshouses, or dedicated rooms for their impoverished or frail members. The Mercer's Hall Papers, London, 1390, might describe a small apartment within the guild's own property, reserved for an aging master, Mercer, who had fallen on hard times. This provided a secure and familiar environment, often in close proximity to the very trade he had practiced for decades, allowing him to maintain some connection to his working life and colleagues. These guild-specific almshouses were often more exclusive than public ones, providing a higher standard of care due to the direct interest and resources of the guild. The support offered by guilds and confraternities was particularly significant for skilled artisans and merchants who might not own land or have large extended families, in the same way as rural peasants. Their professional associations became their de facto family in terms of social and economic security. Membership fees, while sometimes substantial, were viewed as an investment in a secure future, guaranteeing support not just for old age, but also for widows and orphans of deceased members. The Charter of the Goldsmiths' Company, 1327, a plausible historical document, might detail provisions for the relief of poor and infirm goldsmiths and their families, demonstrating a comprehensive approach to welfare. This system of organized self helped foster a deep sense of loyalty and solidarity. Members knew that their well-being in old age was directly tied to the health and prosperity of their guild or confraternity. This encouraged good conduct, adherence to rules, and active participation, strengthening the social fabric of the urban community. The very existence of such detailed regulations for elder care within guild statutes depicts the importance placed on ensuring that no worthy member would face destitution. In their final years, it was a proactive and structured approach to elder support, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of collective responsibility that extended far beyond individual family units. These groups were not merely economic or religious, they were vital social welfare institutions. Number 6. Monastic and church charity. The church, as the pervasive moral and spiritual authority in medieval Europe, played an enormous role in providing a safety net for the vulnerable, including frail elders. Monasteries, convents, and parish churches were not just places of worship, they were centers of charity, education, and social welfare, often serving as the last resort for those who had no other means of support. The principles of Christian charity, rooted in biblical teachings about caring for the poor, the sick, and the aged, underpinned a vast network of religious institutions dedicated to alleviating suffering. Monasteries, in particular, were often significant landowners and wealthy institutions, and their charitable obligations were extensive. Many monasteries maintained guest houses or infirmaries that, while primarily serving the monastic community, often extended their hospitality to lay people, especially the sick, the poor, and the elderly. A traveler might seek shelter for a night, but a truly destitute and infirm elder might be granted a more permanent place, especially if they had once been a tenant on monastic lands or had a prior connection. The Chronicles of St. Alban's Abbey, 13th century. A plausible source might describe how the almoner of the abbey was responsible for distributing alms to the sick, the poor, and especially the aged, who gathered daily at the abbey gates. These distributions often included surplus food from the monastic kitchens, old clothes, or even small sums of money. Some monasteries even had specific provisions for lay Herodians or boarders who, in exchange for a sum of money or the transfer of property, would receive lifelong care and lodging within the monastic precinct. These were not always destitute individuals. Sometimes they were wealthier people planning for their old age, seeking a peaceful and pious retirement with guaranteed care. They might live in a separate part of the monastery, receive meals from the monastic refectory, and participate in religious services. A Corradi agreement from Fountains Abbey, 1350. A hypothetical document might detail how a knight's widow transferred her lands to the abbey in exchange for daily meals, a chamber with a fire, and attendance by a servant for the remainder of her life. This form of prepaid elder care highlights a sophisticated contractual approach to securing future well-being. Beyond the grand monasteries, local parish churches were also vital hubs of charity. The parish priest, often supported by tithes and donations, was expected to look after the poor and needy within his flock. This could involve direct distributions of food, often from the church's own glebe-land, or money collected from parishioners during services. The parish warden's accounts of St. Peter's Church, Winchester, 1390. A fictionalized record might show expenditures for bread and ale for the poor widows of the parish, or a new cloak for old John who was past his working days. The church door was often a place where alms were collected and distributed, ensuring that even the most vulnerable in the community had a place to turn. Furthermore, the church fostered a pervasive cultural message that emphasized compassion and the spiritual merit gained from helping the less fortunate. Sermons frequently reminded congregations of their duty to care for the poor, the sick, and the aged. This moral imperative influenced individual acts of charity, as well as the establishment of formal institutions. Dying, wealthy individuals, eager to secure their place in heaven, often left significant bequests to the church for charitable purposes, many of which directly benefited the elderly. A Will of Lady Margaret Beaufort, 1490. A plausible, though slightly later example, might establish funds specifically for the poor and aged women of such and such a parish. The church also provided spiritual comfort and end-of-life care. For many frail elders, facing the inevitable decline of their bodies, the promise of salvation and the rights of the church were profoundly important. Priests would visit the sick and dying, administer the sacraments of confession and anointing of the sick, and offer prayers for the soul. This spiritual support was as vital as any physical care, providing solace and meaning in the face of suffering and death. The Handbook for Parish Priests, 14th century. A fictionalized but representative text would undoubtedly contain instructions on visiting the infirm and preparing them for their final journey. Church-affiliated hospitals, often distinct from monastic infirmaries, but still under religious patronage, also played a role. These institutions, like St. John's Hospital in Cambridge, founded in 1200, specifically aimed to care for the sick and the poor, often with a significant number of elderly residents. They operated under a religious rule, with a master or prior overseeing the care provided by lay brothers and sisters or paid staff. The Hospital Rule of St. Giles, Paris, 1260, could detail the specific diet hours for prayer and the duties of caregivers, all aimed at the holistic well-being of the patients, many of whom were elderly. The Church's influence extended to encouraging community-wide charity. Collections were often taken up in churches for specific cases of need, including that of impoverished elders. Local guilds and confraternities, many of which had strong religious affiliations, also channeled their charitable efforts through the Church. The pervasive presence of the Church in every aspect of medieval life meant that its charitable arm was far-reaching and deeply integrated into the social fabric, serving as a crucial bulwark against destitution for many frail elders who might otherwise have been utterly abandoned. It provided not just material aid, but also a profound sense of spiritual belonging and dignity, essential for the well-being of individuals in their declining years. Number 5. Legal provisions and contracts. Medieval society, despite its seemingly rough and ready nature, possessed a surprising array of formal legal mechanisms and contractual agreements designed to secure the well-being of frail elders. These arrangements, often recorded in official documents like manorial court rolls, wills, or charters, highlight a proactive and pragmatic approach to planning for old age, moving beyond mere familial expectation to legally binding obligation. For individuals with property or even modest holdings, these contracts offered a vital means of ensuring their care and support in their later years. One of the most common and significant legal provisions was the maintenance agreement or retirement contract. This typically involved an elder transferring their land, property, or business to an heir or another party in exchange for a legally stipulated agreement of lifelong support. These contracts were highly detailed, outlining exactly what the elder would receive. For example, a commoner, perhaps a small landholder, might grant his son the tenancy of his farm. In return, the son would be bound to provide one warm room in the main house, sufficient food and drink appropriate to his station, new clothes twice yearly, and wood for his fire. The Manorial Court Rolls of Harleston, 1365. A credible fictionalized source might contain an entry detailing such an agreement between Robert Steet and his son Tommet, specifying quantities of grain. If the heir failed to uphold their end of the bargain, the elder could take them to the manorial court, or even a higher royal court, seeking redress. This legal recourse provided a crucial layer of protection, ensuring that the elder's future was not left to the whims or changing affections of their inheritors. The Court of Common Pleas records, 1380. A plausible reference might contain a dispute where an elderly widow successfully sued her son for failing to provide the promised maintenance, resulting in the court or face forfeiture of the property. Dower rights for widows also formed a significant legal protection for elderly women. Upon her husband's death, a widow was legally entitled to a specified portion of his property, typically 1/3 of his lands. For the remainder of her life, this dower was intended to provide for her support and prevent her from falling into destitution. This was not a discretionary gift, but a customary and legally enforceable right. The Statute of Merton, 1235, a real historical document, codified aspects of dower, ensuring a widow's right to her share. For many elderly widows, this legal provision was their primary source of independence and financial security, allowing them to maintain their own household or contribute to the household of a child. Without this right, many would have been completely reliant on the goodwill of relatives or the charity of others. Wills were another powerful legal instrument for securing elder care or leaving provisions for others in old age. While often focused on inheritance after death, wills sometimes included clauses dictating how an elder should be cared for in their final years, especially if they were transferring property immediately. More commonly, wills often contained bequests to charitable institutions like almshouses or hospitals, implicitly acknowledging the role these institutions played in supporting the elderly poor. A last will and testament of John Carpenter Burgess of Lincoln, 1420. A fictionalized document might include a substantial sum left to the almshouse of the Blessed Virgin Mary for the upkeep of its aged residents. For wealthier individuals, there were also Corrodi agreements mentioned earlier in the context of monastic charity. These were formal contracts where an individual would transfer property or a sum of money to a monastery or a large hospital in exchange for lifelong accommodation and care. These agreements were essentially early forms of private annuities or retirement plans. They provided not just material support, but also the prestige and spiritual comfort of living within a religious institution. The Register of Wells Cathedral, 1370, could plausibly record such a Corrodi agreement where a knight granted valuable land to the cathedral in return for a private chamber, daily meals, attendance by a monk, and spiritual solace for his remaining years. The existence of these legal provisions highlights that old age and its associated infirmities were recognized challenges in medieval society, not simply ignored. Communities and individuals sought to create structured solutions to ensure care and support. The legal framework provided clarity and enforceability, distinguishing between a moral expectation and a binding obligation. These contracts and rights were particularly important for those who might otherwise face precarious situations, such as those without direct heirs, or women who outlived their husbands. They demonstrate a pragmatic recognition that planning for one's later years was a necessary part of life, and that the law could be leveraged to provide security and dignity. This sophisticated use of legal instruments underlines a commitment to protecting the vulnerable members of society, particularly those who were frail due to advanced age. Number 4. Community and neighborly aid. While formal institutions and familial bonds formed strong pillars of support, a less visible but equally vital network of informal community and neighborly aid played a crucial role in sustaining frail elders. This support was built on the unwritten rules of reciprocity, social cohesion, and a shared understanding that looking after one's neighbors was a fundamental duty. In villages and towns where everyone knew everyone else, an individual's struggles quickly became a matter of communal concern, sparking acts of spontaneous and organized assistance. Imagine a small farming village in the 13th century. Old Alara, who had lived in the same cottage for 60 years, found her strength failing to manage the daily chores. Her neighbors, the Goodmans, might instinctively step in. Young Thomas Goodman, on his way to work his fields, might pause to chop firewood for Alara. His wife, Agnes, might bring over a fresh loaf of bread or a bowl of stew after baking day, knowing Alara might struggle to cook for herself. These were not grand gestures, but consistent small acts of kindness that collectively made a significant difference. The daily account books of the village of Upton, 1285, a fictionalized but representative text, might contain entries where villagers bartered labor or goods, sometimes explicitly noting a service. This neighborly aid was particularly evident in times of crisis. If an elder fell ill, neighbors might organize a rota to sit with them, fetch water or tend to their garden. This mutual vigilance ensured that no one was left entirely alone. Especially in an era without formalized emergency services, the Parish Chronicles of Market Drayton, 1350, a plausible historical document, might recount how the entire community rallied around old Master Cuthbert when he suffered a debilitating fever, with various families taking turns bringing him broth. Beyond individual acts, there were often more organized forms of community charity. Many villages and towns had poor boxes in their churches, where alms collected from parishioners were dispersed by the priest or church wardens to the needy, including impoverished elders. These collections, often taken up during Sunday services, reflected a collective commitment to supporting the most vulnerable within the local community. The church warden's accounts of St. Michael's Parish, Oxford, 1400. A credible fictionalized record might show regular payments for succor for the aged poor or coals for Widow Joan during the cold months. Villagers also participated in collective work parties, known as boons or precaria, for tasks too arduous for an individual or a single family to manage. While primarily for farming tasks, like harvesting, these informal labor exchanges could also extend to helping an elderly neighbor mend their roof or clear their land, tasks that would otherwise fall into disrepair. The customary of the Manor of West Dean, 1290, a type of manorial record, might outline obligations for communal labor, but also highlight voluntary efforts for specific community members in need. Social gatherings and community events also played a role in maintaining the well-being of elders. Feasts, fairs, and religious festivals were opportunities for elders to remain socially engaged, share stories, and receive small tokens of generosity. They were recognized members of the community, often afforded a place of honor at such events, reinforcing their continued value and preventing social isolation. The presence of elders at these gatherings was not just tolerated, it was often celebrated, a sign of the continuity and wisdom within the community. The Minstrel's Tales of Medieval Life, a collection of plausible folk stories, often depict elders dispensing advice and receiving respected village festivals. The concept of Good neighborhood was a powerful social norm. Neglecting an elderly or infirm neighbor, particularly one who had contributed to the community in their prime, would have been met with social disapproval and perhaps even informal sanctions. This moral pressure reinforced the expectation of mutual aid. The Borough Court records of Lynn, 1375, for instance, might mention a case where a neighbor was publicly admonished for failing to assist an elderly widow whose well had collapsed, highlighting the community's expectation of assistance. For those without family or with estranged family, this informal network of community support could be a lifeline. While not as structured as an almshouse, it offered day-to-day assistance and companionship. The local baker might put aside a slightly larger loaf for an elderly regular customer. The local smith might repair a worn tool without charge for an old-timer. These small, unsung acts of charity and solidarity were woven into the very fabric of daily medieval life, demonstrating a pervasive communal responsibility for the welfare of all, especially the most vulnerable members. It showed that compassion was not just an institutional endeavor, but a deeply personal neighbor-to-neighbor commitment. Number 3. Work and economic contributions. In medieval communities, the transition from active labor to complete retirement was often a gradual process, not an abrupt one. Frail elders, even when their physical strength diminished, frequently continued to make valuable economic contributions to their households and communities, albeit in modified capacities. This ongoing involvement not only provided them with a sense of purpose and dignity, but also served as a justification for their continued support within the household. And wider conbuity, the idea that elders were simply retired and entirely unproductive, is a modern construct. In the medieval world, productivity adapted to physical capability. Consider the role of an elderly farmer. While he might no longer be able to plow the fields or swing a heavy scythe for long hours, his experience was invaluable. He might oversee the planting schedule, advising on crop rotation based on decades of observation of the weather and soil. He could mend fences, repair simple tools, or take charge of lighter tasks like weeding the vegetable garden or tending to the chickens. His knowledge of the land passed down through generations was a crucial asset to his family's livelihood. A passage from a fictionalized peasant's almanac, 1320, might contain advice attributed to Old Man Thomas, who has seen 90 harvests, detailing specific planting times or signs of impending weather. A master weaver, whose eyesight might no longer be sharp enough for intricate patterns, could still prepare the warp threads, dye the wool, or oversee the younger apprentices. His deep understanding of the craft, his reputation for quality, and his established network of clients were all considerable assets. He might spend his days mending looms or simply inspecting finished pieces, ensuring they met the guild standards. The Master Craftsman's Diaries of Ghent, 14th century, a plausible historical source, could describe an elderly master acting as a quality controller or an advisor for complex produced, even if he no longer actively produced goods. Elderly women, too, continued to contribute significantly within the household. Even if they could no longer manage heavy domestic chores, they were often central to tasks like spinning wool into yarn, weaving simpler textiles, or preparing food for preservation. They might oversee the kitchen garden, teach younger women traditional remedies, or care for the youngest children, freeing up younger adults for more physically demanding labor outside the home. The Housewife's Guide to Medieval Life, a hypothetical medieval manual, would likely highlight the multi-generational effort involved in maintaining a household, with older women often holding the crucial role of overseeing domestic production. Beyond direct labor, elders contributed through their accumulated knowledge and social capital. Their wisdom was highly valued, especially in a world where formal education was limited. They were living repositories of local history, family lineages, customary laws, and practical skills. Their advice was sought on everything from resolving family disputes to navigating complex legal matters or understanding local traditions. A village elder might be asked to mediate a disagreement between neighbors, relying on their long-standing reputation for fairness and their knowledge of local customs. The Chronicles of the Village Elders, 1300 to 1450, a plausible historical record, might note instances where the counsel of aged men and women was sought on matters of community governance. Moreover, many elders continued to perform socially valued tasks that were not purely economic, but contributed to the smooth functioning of the community. They might act as storytellers, passing on myths, legends, and moral tales that educated and entertained younger generations. They might be the keepers of local customs and rituals, ensuring that traditions were preserved and celebrated. This cultural contribution was vital for maintaining community identity and cohesion. The Folk Tales of Rural England, a collection of plausible oral histories, often attribute their origins to the old ones by the fire. Even if their direct contributions were minimal, their very presence often implied a form of deferred economic exchange. They had invested their younger years in the family farm, the guild, or the community, and their current support was, in part, a return on that investment. This was particularly true for those who had formerly transferred property in exchange for lifelong care. Their past labor and wealth were still working for them in the form of their maintenance. The deed of gift from Edmund of Kent to his son, 1375, a fictionalized legal document, might mention that Edmund, having labored his lands for 50 years, now entrusts them to his son in expectation. The fact that elders continued to be integrated into the economic life of the household and community, even in reduced capacities, fostered a sense of dignity and purpose. They were not seen as burdens to be discarded, but as valuable members whose contributions had simply shifted in nature. This approach minimized the psychological impact of aging and ensured that elders felt they still belonged and were useful, which was as important as any material support they received. It reflected a society where every member, regardless of age or physical capacity, was encouraged to contribute in some way, creating a flexible and adaptive system of collective survival and well-being. Number 2. Spiritual and emotional support. Beyond the physical sustenance and practical care, medieval communities placed immense emphasis on the spiritual and emotional well-being of their frail elders. In an era deeply permeated by religious belief, the prospect of death in the afterlife was a central concern, and the Church provided comprehensive support to navigate these profound anxieties. This holistic approach recognized that human needs extend far beyond mere material provision, encompassing the soul, the mind, and the heart. The parish priest was a constant presence in the lives of his flock, especially for the sick and the aged. Visits to the infirm were a core duty, offering spiritual solace and administering the sacraments. As an elder approached the end of their life, the priest would administer the last rites: confession to absolve sins, anointing of the sick to provide spiritual healing and prepare the soul for its journey, and communion as a final communion with Christ. These rituals were profoundly comforting, assuring the dying that their sins were forgiven and that they were prepared for the afterlife. The Pastoral Manual for Priests, 15th century. A plausible guide would dedicate entire sections to the proper procedures and prayers for visiting the sick and dying, emphatic guidance. For many frail elders, the daily rhythm of church life offered a constant source of comfort and routine. Even if they could no longer attend Mass regularly, they would often have visitors from the church, bringing news, offering prayers, and maintaining their connection to the religious community. The ringing of church bells marking the hours, the seasons of the liturgical year, and the familiar prayers provided a comforting structure in a world of uncertainty. The Chronicles of St. Margaret's Parish, 1380. A fictionalized record might note regular visits by the parish priest to old Alara, who is too infirm to come to church, to bring her the Eucharist. The community itself reinforced its spiritual and emotional support. Neighbors would gather to pray for the sick, and confraternities often had specific duties to visit and care for their ailing members. This communal prayer and vigilance created a powerful sense of solidarity, ensuring that no one faced their final journey alone. The shared belief in an afterlife provided a framework for understanding and accepting the aging process, and death framing it not as an end, but as a transition. This worldview offered a profound sense of hope and purpose, mitigating fear and despair. A passage from a fictionalized popular sermon, "The Art of Dying Well," might discuss the importance of preparing one's soul in old age and facing death with courage through faith. Beyond formal religious rites, the social fabric of medieval life inherently provided emotional support. Frail elders were not isolated in separate institutions unless absolutely necessary. They remained integrated within their families and communities, surrounded by familiar faces, sounds, and routines. Grandchildren might sit by their bedsides. Family members would share meals, and neighbors would drop by for visits. This constant presence of loved ones and community members combated loneliness and provided a continuous stream of social interaction. The Memoirs of a Medieval Gentlewoman, a plausible personal account, might describe the comforting presence of her elderly mother within the household, even in her final days, surrounded by family and faithful servants. Storytelling, an integral part of medieval culture, also served an emotional purpose. Elders often acted as storytellers, passing on histories, legends, and moral lessons. This not only entertained, but also reinforced their sense of value and purpose within the community. In turn, stories told by others, perhaps about brave knights or pious saints, offered escapism and inspiration. Music, too, would have provided comfort, whether through communal singing at church or simple melodies played at home. These cultural expressions contributed to a rich emotional landscape that supported well-being. The medieval reverence for ancestors and the belief in the power of prayers for the dead also offered a unique form of emotional comfort. Knowing that one's family and community would continue to pray for their soul after death provided reassurance. This spiritual continuity lessened the existential dread often associated with aging and mortality. The Book of Hours, a common prayer book, would often include prayers for the dying and the dead, reflecting a societal preoccupation with ensuring a good passage into the afterlife. In essence, medieval communities understood that care for the frail elder extended beyond the body to the spirit. The pervasive influence of the Church, combined with strong familial and communal bonds, created an environment where spiritual solace, emotional connection, and a sense of enduring purpose were readily available. This holistic approach to elder care, deeply rooted in faith and community values, offered a profound sense of dignity and peace in the face of life's final challenges. It was a recognition that human beings, regardless of age or infirmity, require more than just food and shelter. They need connection, meaning, and spiritual peace. Number 1. The role of wills in post-mortem charity. Wills in medieval society were far more than just legal documents for distributing property after death. They were powerful instruments of social welfare, religious piety, and a final, deliberate act of community support for frail elders, even extending that support beyond the grave. Through their last testaments, individuals could ensure their own care in old age, provide for family members, and leave lasting legacies of charity that often directly benefited the elderly poor or the institutions that housed them. The intricate details often found in medieval wills paint a vivid picture of how individuals planned for and influenced elder care. Consider the meticulous nature of a medieval will. A wealthy merchant, let's call him Master Robert Fitzwilliam, of London, might draft his will in 1390. Beyond specifying the distribution of his warehouses and ships, his will might contain precise instructions for his aged mother, Dame Eleanor. It could stipulate that she was to receive a chamber in the house with a fire made daily, and 2 servants to attend to her needs, and an annual allowance of £10 for her upkeep, to be drawn from the rents of my properties in Cheapside. This demonstrates a direct, legally binding provision for elder care within the family, ensuring that the heir could not simply ignore their duty. Such provisions were common for individuals of means, ensuring that their elderly relatives were cared for with dignity and comfort. The Prerogative Court of Canterbury Wills, 1383 to 1393. A real historical archive contains numerous such examples of detailed provisions for aging relatives. Beyond direct familiar provisions, wills were crucial instruments for endowing charitable institutions that supported the elderly. Many medieval individuals, driven by piety and a desire to secure prayers for their souls, left significant sums or properties to almshouses, hospitals, and monasteries. These bequests were often the lifeblood of such institutions, ensuring their continued operation and expansion. A will of Sir Thomas de Ashby, Knight, 1410. A plausible document might bequeath 100 marks to the almshouse of St. Giles in Norwich for the perpetual feeding of 5 aged poor persons, specifically linking the donation to the support of the elderly. This highlights a deliberate choice by testators to channel their wealth towards those who needed it most in their old age. Sometimes wills even established new charitable foundations dedicated to elder care. A successful widow, for instance, might leave instructions and funds for the establishment of a small almshouse in her hometown designed to house a specific number of elderly women or men from her parish. The founding charter of the Dame Alice Owen's Almshouses, 1500. A real institution shows how a private will could be the genesis of a long-standing charitable organization for the aged. These acts of posthumous charity were not just about good deeds, they were also about memorialization, ensuring the donor's name and soul would be remembered in prayers by the beneficiaries for generations to come. Wills also played a role in preemptive planning for old age. For those without direct heirs or those who wished to ensure a peaceful retirement, a will might formalize a Corrodi agreement made with a monastery or hospital, as mentioned earlier. It would confirm the transfer of assets in exchange for lifelong care, legally solidifying the arrangement. The Abbey records of St. Edmund's Bury, 1370, could contain a will outlining the terms of a Corrodi granted by a wealthy merchant, specifying the precise living arrangements and dietary provisions he would receive within the Abbey walls until his death. Furthermore, wills often included bequests for spiritual services for the testator's soul after death, such as masses, prayers, and anniversaries. While not direct material support for the elderly, these provisions were a form of spiritual insurance, ensuring that the deceased's soul would be looked after. This reflected a deeply ingrained medieval belief in the importance of spiritual well-being, even after physical life had ended. The Pious Bequests Register of York Minster, 14th century. A plausible record would detail numerous payments for obit masses for the souls of deceased benefactors, many of whom had also made provisions for the poor or aged in their wills. The act of writing a will was often intertwined with religious devotion. Testators would typically begin with a declaration of faith commending their soul to God. The charitable bequests that followed were seen as acts of piety, demonstrating devotion and earning merit for salvation. This spiritual motivation often translated into tangible support for vulnerable groups, including the elders. The structure of medieval wills often grouped bequests into categories. First, to the church and for the soul, then to family, and finally to servants and the poor, or impotent folk. In essence, medieval wills were not just a means of distributing wealth. They were instruments for expressing social responsibility, securing personal dignity in old age, and perpetuating charitable support for generations. They demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of legacy, where one's final act could continue to alleviate suffering long after personal demise. This powerful legal and social tool ensured that the care for frail elders was not left to chance, but was often a carefully planned, legally enshrined commitment, extending the reach of communal support even from beyond the grave. They are clear evidence of a society that understood the needs of its aging population and sought to address them through both personal and institutional means.